The 1879 Army Corps of Engineers survey of the Washington Monuments Foundation contains a line that does not appear in the published summary. It describes a void, not a drainage channel, not a geological formation. A void, rectangular, at a depth consistent with deliberate excavation. The original report recommends encasement. The published summary recommends reinforcement. These are not the same recommendation. Both were completed. The chamber was sealed in 1934, and the renovation records cite structural necessity, and no subsequent inspection has been publicly authorized. The dimensions remain on file. The distinction between encasement and reinforcement has never been formally explained. Beneath the Washington Monument, below the marble courses that every tourist photographs and every schoolbook reproduces, there is a foundation chamber that the National Park Service describes as structurally necessary. The dimensions are recorded, roughly 23 feet square, sealed in the 1880s with materials chosen for permanence rather than access. The official explanation is sensible. It is the kind of explanation that ends inquiry. But the Army Corps of Engineers report filed in 1879, not the published summary, the full report, held now in the Corps' historical archive, uses a different word when describing what the foundation crew encountered at depth. Not bedrock, not fill. The word they used was obstruction. No further entry follows. I was not looking for the Washington Monument when I found this. I had spent the better part of 3 months in the Smithsonian Institution archives working through correspondence related to the early survey of the National Mall, specifically the records surrounding the positioning of the original boundary stones, which had been my actual subject. 4 boundary stones, placed in 1791 and 1792, marking the corners of the original federal district. Simple enough, the kind of research that produces a paper, maybe a footnote in someone else's book, and then quietly ends. But archival research does not always end where you expect it to. Sometimes a folder is misfiled, sometimes a document has been placed, through some cataloger's error or deliberate obscurity, inside a box that has nothing to do with its contents. That is how I found the survey annotations. They were handwritten on paper that the archivist's accession note dated to somewhere between 1845 and 1852, and they referenced the monument site not as a completed structure. It would not be completed until 1884, but as an active excavation. They described what the survey team observed when the ground was first broken for the foundation of what Robert Mills, born in 1781 and dead by 1855, had designed as something considerably grander than what now stands on the mall. Mills's design is the first thing most architectural historians mention when they discuss the monument's history, and then they move past it quickly. The colonnaded base, a circular Greek Revival portico, 30 columns, rising to a height of nearly 100 feet before the obelisk itself began, never appeared in the final structure. The official record attributes this to cost. Congress approved a scaled-back version after the Washington National Monument Society ran short of funds, and the colonnaded base was simply never built. That is the explanation. It is reasonable. It has been repeated so many times that it no longer invites examination. But Mills's design documents, portions of which are held in the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, include something the standard architectural histories rarely linger on. Beneath the colonnaded base, in the drawings Mills submitted to the Monument Society in 1846, there are subterranean specifications, a lower level, described in the accompanying notes as a repository, Mills's word used without elaboration. The drawings show dimensions, they show access points, they show, in the careful cross-hatching Mills used for materials he considered permanent, walls of considerable thickness. The Monument Society's cornerstone was laid on the 4th of July, 1848. Work proceeded through 1849, 1850, 1851, 1852, and into 1853. The Society's published progress reports during these years are detailed about the marble being sourced and the courses being laid above ground. They are considerably less detailed about what was happening below ground during the same period. The foundation excavation for a structure of the monument's intended height, Mills's full design called for a final elevation of over 600 feet, would have required substantial below-grade work. The soil conditions near the Potomac required it. Standard engineering of the era required it. Yet the detailed below-grade records from this period, which should exist as a matter of engineering practice, are not where the finding aids say they should be. The Smithsonian's Construction Archive lists them. The finding aid entry is specific. Foundation construction records, Washington National Monument, 1848 through 1854. Box number, folder number, accession number. I have the citation written in my notes in 2 places because I wrote it down twice, the second time to make sure I had not misread it. When I requested the box, the archivist returned to tell me that it had not been seen since a cataloging review in 1961. Not lost precisely, not destroyed precisely, simply not where the record says it should be. This happens in archives. Materials migrate. Boxes are reshelved incorrectly over decades. It is, individually, unremarkable. Robert Mills did not live to see the construction halt. He died on the 3rd of March, 1855, at the age of 73, having watched the structure he designed rise to approximately 152 feet before the money ran out. The official cause of the halt in 1854 was indeed financial. The Washington National Monument Society had depleted its resources, and Congress had declined to take over the project. But Mills, in correspondence now held at the South Carolina Historical Society, wrote in the final year of his life about the monument in terms that do not read like a man describing a funding problem. He wrote about what had been prepared beneath. He did not elaborate. The letter was written to his son. It was not intended for publication. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that Mills's private correspondence constitutes proof of anything. A dying man writing to his son may compress and obscure meaning in ways that do not survive the removal of context. What I am noting is that the phrase exists, that it has a specific referent, what had been prepared beneath, and that the below-grade construction records from the years when that preparation would have occurred are not in the archive where the finding aid places them. Here's what I keep coming back to. Mills designed a subterranean repository. The construction records from the years when that repository would have been built have not been located. Mills, in the last year of his life, referred to something prepared beneath the structure. And when the Army Corps of Engineers examined the foundation in 1879, preparing for the resumption of construction after a gap of nearly a quarter century, the word their surveyor used, in the full report, not the summary, was obstruction. Not foundation, not bedrock, not irregularity, obstruction. The monument that stands today was completed in 1884, rising to 555 feet and 5 inches above the mall. It is the tallest masonry structure in the world. It was, at the time of its completion, the tallest structure of any kind. The capstone was set on the 6th of December, 1884, and the aluminum tip, then among the most expensive metals available, was placed with ceremony and recorded in detail. The above-ground record of the monument's construction is extraordinarily complete. Thousands of documents, hundreds of photographs from the later construction phase, engineering reports, material invoices, worker rosters, congressional testimony. The below-ground record is not complete. That asymmetry is where I found myself, 3 months into research that was supposed to be about boundary stones, holding a finding aid that pointed to a box that could not be located, reading a dead architect's private letter about something prepared beneath, and sitting with a single word from an 1879 Army Corps report that no one had apparently found worth examining in the 145 years since it was filed. I have not resolved this. I want to say that plainly. What follows is what I found when I kept looking, what the record contains, what it omits, and what the gap between those two things may mean for the structure that 2 million visitors photograph each year without knowing that the word obstruction exists in a box in the Army Corps of Engineers Historical Archive in Alexandria, Virginia, waiting for the next person who happens to be looking for something else entirely. The design Mills submitted to the Washington National Monument Society in 1846 was not the stripped obelisk that stands today. It was something considerably more ambitious and considerably more layered. The colonnaded base he specified called for 30 Doric columns arranged in a continuous circular portico, rising to a height of approximately 100 feet, before the shaft of the obelisk began its ascent. Around the interior of that base, Mills placed niches for statuary. He specified the dimensions of the entry passages. And in the cross-sectional drawings, the ones held today in the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division under the catalog heading Washington National Monument Society Records, 1844 through 1854. He detailed a level below grade, not a crawl space, not a drainage channel, a repository. That is the word Mills used, written in his own hand in the marginal notes of the 1846 submission. The dimensions he specified for this lower level were substantial, roughly 30 feet across, with walls drawn in the cross-hatching he reserved for load-bearing permanent construction. The access points were internal, reached from within the colonnaded base, not from any exterior entrance. Mills did not elaborate on the repository's intended purpose in the submission documents. He drew it, dimensioned it, specified its materials, and said nothing further about what it was meant to hold. The colonnaded base was never built. That is the official record, and on this point the official record is not disputed. Congress declined to fund the grander design, the Monument Society accepted a scaled-back plan, and the obelisk proceeded without its base. The above-ground omission is documented thoroughly. What is less thoroughly documented is the sequence of below-grade work that occurred between the laying of the cornerstone on the 4th of July, 1848, and the construction halt in the autumn of 1854. The 6 years during which foundation excavation and early structural work were underway, and during which whatever Mills had specified for below grade would either have been built, partially built, or formally abandoned. The foundation construction records from those 6 years are the ones listed in the Smithsonian Institution Archives finding aid and not currently located in the box where the finding aid places them. I want to be precise about this. The finding aid exists. The accession entry exists. The box number exists. The box, as of the most recent inquiry I was able to make through the reading room, has not been retrieved successfully since a cataloging review in 1961. The archivist I spoke with noted this was not unprecedented for materials of that age and provenance. She was correct. It is not unprecedented. It is also not resolved. Which brings me to the autumn of 1855. On the night of the 5th of March, 1855, members of the Know Nothing Party, formerly the American Party, a nativist political organization then at the height of its influence, broke into the storage area near the monument construction site and removed a block of marble that had been donated by Pope Pius IX for inclusion in the monument's interior stairwell. The stone had arrived from Rome as a fragment taken from the Temple of Concord, and its donation had been publicized, which made it a target. The Know-Nothings objected to papal involvement in an American national monument. They took the stone. Contemporary accounts describe it as having been thrown into the Potomac, though no recovery was ever documented and the river has never confirmed this. The incident itself is recorded. It appears in congressional testimony from 1855 and in the Washington Evening Star's coverage from that same month. What is less often noted is what followed institutionally. The Washington National Monument Society, already weakened financially, lost its congressional standing almost immediately after the incident. A faction of Know-Nothing members gained effective control of the society by the summer of 1855 and held that control for roughly 2 years, during which the construction records from the active building phase were officially transferred with paperwork from the Society's offices to a federal depository whose subsequent history is difficult to trace. The transfer was logged. The receiving institution has not been conclusively identified in any secondary source I have found. The construction did not resume under federal authority until 1879. That is a gap of 25 years from the halt, 31 years from the cornerstone. During those 3 decades, the partially constructed shaft stood open to weather on the mall, the foundation was exposed to seasonal freeze and thaw, and the site was used intermittently for purposes the official record describes with some vagueness as military and agricultural during the Civil War years. What happened to the below-grade elements of the foundation during those 31 years, whether they were inspected, whether they were altered, whether they were documented, is not established in any source I have been able to locate. Not neglect, erasure. The distinction matters. Neglect is passive. Records decay, institutions lose funding, attention moves elsewhere. What happened to the monument's foundation documentation between 1854 and 1879 has the texture of something different. The Society's records were transferred with paperwork. The transfer destination is untraced. The construction records listed in the Smithsonian Finding Aid are not in their box. Mills's private correspondence references something prepared beneath in a letter not intended for circulation. These are not the signatures of an institution that forgot. They are the signatures of an institution that moved things. The documents were transferred, the transfer was logged. The log references a receiving institution. The receiving institution does not appear in the subsequent federal record. The foundation construction files were placed in the finding aid. The finding aid entries remain. The boxes are not where the entries say they should be. Consider what that sequence requires. It requires that someone at some point created a paper trail that leads to a destination that cannot be followed. That is not the signature of fire or flood. Fire destroys the document and the entry together. What we have here is the entry without the document, a pointer that has been left in place while the thing it points to has been removed. That is a different kind of loss entirely. I have spent enough time in archives to know that misfiled boxes and incomplete transfers happen without intention, without design, without anyone deciding that a particular set of records should be made inaccessible. I know this. I am not dismissing it. But I am also noting that the specific records that are absent, the foundation construction files, the below-grade specifications, the transfer destination for the Society's papers, are precisely the records that would speak most directly to what was built beneath the monument before the halt. Other records from the same institution in the same period are present. The above-grade construction records are substantially intact. The marble procurement invoices are intact. The labor rosters for the above-grade work are intact. The below-grade records are the ones that are not. That asymmetry is where the accumulation begins. Not with a single missing box, not with a private letter, not with a word in an Army Corps report, with all of them together and with the particular character of what is absent. Not random, not distributed evenly across the documentary record, but concentrated precisely in the layer of the archive that would speak to what lies beneath the foundation of the tallest masonry structure in the world. One more thing before I move forward. In the labor records that do survive, the above-grade worker rosters from 1848 through 1853, there is an entry for a man listed as Thomas Clary, stonecutter, first appearing in the payroll ledger for the quarter ending December 1849. He appears in every subsequent quarterly ledger through the spring of 1854, which places him on the site for approximately 4.5 years. His entry disappears from the rosters in the summer of 1854, several months before the official construction halt. There is no termination note, no forwarding record. The ledger simply stops recording his name. The above-grade work he would have contributed to is documented. Whatever he worked on below grade, if he worked below grade, is in the files that are not, in their box. The construction halt of 1854 and the institutional silence that followed it did not occur in isolation. That is the thing I kept returning to as I worked through the adjacent records. The sense that the monument's missing documentation was not a singular gap, but rather one depression in a landscape of them, each one explicable on its own terms, each one deepening in meaning when placed beside the others. The second event worth examining closely happened on the evening of January 24, 1871. A fire broke out in the Interior Department building on F Street in Washington, in the offices then housing the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The fire burned through the night. By morning, the Bureau had lost an estimated 40,000 individual documents, correspondence, treaty records, land surveys, and the accumulated administrative history of the federal government's interactions with tribal nations across the preceding 3 decades. The Interior Department's own report, filed in February of 1871, described the loss as catastrophic and irretrievable. Congress acknowledged the loss. An investigation was opened. The investigation produced no finding of arson, no finding of negligence beyond the building's inadequate fire suppression, and no finding of anything other than an unfortunate accident in an old structure. Reasonable, completely reasonable. What the Interior Department's February report does not dwell on, though it does record in a passage near the end of the document that researchers have noted as easy to overlook, is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices had, in the weeks before the fire, been sharing storage space with a collection of Washington territorial administrative records that were in the process of being transferred to a new federal depository. The territorial records covered the period from 1850 to 1871, the exact years bracketing the monument's construction halt and the site's period of federal neglect. Those records were in the building on the night of January 24th. They did not survive. The transfer had been logged. The receiving depository had been designated. The records never arrived. Washington's territorial government was reorganized in 1871, the same year as the fire, replaced by a governor appointed directly by the president. The reorganization generated its own documentation, which survives. The pre-reorganization territorial records, which would have included any administrative observations of the monument site during the period when it stood open and unattended, do not. Then there is the matter of the Census Bureau fire. On January 10, 1921, a fire began in the Commerce Department building in Washington, in the section of the building that housed the records of the United States Census Bureau. The records stored there included the original enumeration sheets from the census of 1900, individual household records, handwritten by census enumerators walking door to door across every county in the country, capturing names, ages, occupations, relationships, and places of birth for every person the enumerators reached. 62 million individual records. That is the number the Commerce Department placed on the loss in its own damage assessment, filed in March of 1921. 62 million entries, representing the most granular portrait of American life available at the turn of the 20th century, gone in a single overnight fire in a federal building in the Capitol. The official cause was electrical. The building had been flagged in an internal facilities report from 1919 as inadequately protected against fire risk for the volume and irreplaceability of the records it housed. The report recommended either the installation of additional suppression systems or the transfer of the most irreplaceable materials to a more suitable facility. The recommendation was noted. It was not acted upon before January 10, 1921. The Census Bureau fire is well documented in the secondary literature. It has its own entry in the National Archives' official history of records losses, and the phrase, "the 1900 census," has become a recognized absence in genealogical research, a gap that researchers work around rather than through. What is less often noted in the standard accounts is the specific nature of the records that were lost alongside the census enumeration sheets. Among the materials stored in the same section of the building were the administrative correspondence files of the Census Bureau from the period 1880 through 1910, including any correspondence related to the federal government's enumeration of workers and residents associated with the Washington Monument's construction and the National Mall's development during the final phase of the monument's completion. Those files were administrative. They were considered lower priority than the enumeration sheets. They were stored in the same room. They burned with everything else. Now consider the math. A person born in 1848, the year the monument's cornerstone was laid, and living to the age of 75 would have died in 1923. They would have been alive through the construction halt, through the know-nothing occupation of the site, through the 31 years of federal disengagement, through the resumption of construction in 1879, through the completion in 1884, and through the sealing of the foundation in the years immediately following. They would have been a young adult when the above-grade construction resumed, old enough to have worked on the site or lived near it, old enough to remember what the site looked like during the years of interruption. They would have died 2 years after the Census Bureau fire. They would have died before any systematic historical inquiry into the monument's foundation history was undertaken. Anyone who might have spoken to them, anyone who might have recorded their account, would themselves have been elderly by the time such an inquiry began, and would have been working from memory rather than documentation, since the documentation had by then been consumed, transferred to untraceable destinations, or placed in boxes that the finding aids could no longer locate. The living chain of memory from the monument's foundation years to the present runs through a window of approximately 75 years, from the cornerstone laying in 1848 to roughly the early 1920s, during which the people who had direct knowledge were alive and the documentation was intact. By the time the window closed, the Bureau of Indian Affairs fire had taken the territorial records. The Census Bureau fire had taken 62 million household entries and their accompanying administrative files. The Monument Society's foundation construction records had been transferred to a depository that subsequent researchers have not been able to confirm. And the persons who had worked the site, lived near it, observed it during its years of interruption, were gone. 3 institutions, 2 fires, 1 transfer with no confirmed destination, all within a span that a single human lifetime could have bridged, and just barely did not. Each one is explicable. The Bureau of Indian Affairs fire was in an old building with inadequate suppression. The Census Bureau fire was in an understaffed facility that had been flagged for risk 2 years earlier and received no remediation. The Monument Society's records transfer was a routine administrative action that suffered from the same incomplete follow-through that afflicts thousands of institutional transfers from that era. None of these events requires deliberate coordination to explain. None of them individually constitutes evidence of anything beyond institutional failure and the ordinary entropy that consumes paper records when nobody is paying careful enough attention. That is precisely what makes the accumulation so difficult to set aside. Not one event, not 2, 3 distinct institutions, each losing materials relevant to the same period and the same site, within a span of 50 years, bracketed by the moment the foundation was dug and the moment the last person who had seen it unsealed was gone. The individual explanations are sufficient. The individual explanations have always been sufficient. It is only when you lay them side by side in sequence that the sufficiency starts to feel like the point. Like the explanations were designed to be sufficient precisely because sufficiency ends inquiry. Here's what I keep coming back to. In the labor records that survive from the monument's active construction years, the above-grade worker rosters held in the Smithsonian Institution archives, the quarterly payroll ledgers that document the men who cut and laid the marble courses above the foundation line. There is an entry for a man named Thomas Clary, stonecutter. His name first appears in the payroll ledger for the quarter ending December of 1849, approximately 18 months after the cornerstone ceremony. He appears in every subsequent quarterly ledger through the spring of 1854. That is 4.5 years of continuous employment on the monument site, during which the foundation work and the lower courses of the shaft were the primary activity. His entry disappears from the rosters in the summer of 1854, several months before the official construction halt. No termination note, no forwarding record, no notation of injury or death. The ledger simply stops recording his name in the same quiet way that ledgers stop recording things when no one has decided the stopping needs an explanation. What Thomas Clary saw during those 4.5 years, what the foundation looked like from the inside of the excavation, what was built below the line that the above-grade records begin, is not in any document I have been able to locate. His name exists. His presence on the site exists quarterly for 54 months. His knowledge does not exist anywhere in the archive. It existed once in the memory of a man whose subsequent history is unrecorded, and then it stopped existing. That is the human texture of what we are describing when we talk about missing foundation records. Not abstractions, not filing errors. A man who was there, whose name appears in ink on paper that has survived 175 years, and whose testimony was never collected, never sought, never considered worth the trouble of finding. The above-grade record is intact. The below-grade record is Thomas Clary's silence, which brings me to the question that the accumulation of these events makes unavoidable. Not the question of whether the records were lost, they were. Not the question of whether individual institutions made reasonable decisions with inadequate resources. They did. The question is whether the specific character of what is absent, concentrated as it is in precisely the layer of the historical record that would speak to what lies beneath the monument's foundation, constitutes something more than the ordinary entropy of institutional memory. I do not have a clean answer. What I have is what comes next. In the spring of 1879, the Army Corps of Engineers sent a team to the monument site to assess the condition of the foundation before the federal government committed to resuming construction. The team was led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lincoln Casey, born in 1831, who would go on to oversee the monument's completion and whose own papers are held at the Library of Congress. The assessment Casey's team produced was thorough. It ran to several dozen pages and examined the foundation's structural integrity after 25 years of exposure to weather, the weight of the partial shaft, and whatever had occurred at the site during the Civil War years when it served functions, the official record describes only vaguely. The published summary of Casey's 1879 assessment, which appeared in the Congressional Record and in the Army Corps' official annual report, describes the foundation as fundamentally sound with some settlement, concerns that could be addressed through reinforcement, structurally adequate, safe to build upon. The summary is reassuring, and it accomplished its purpose. Congress authorized the resumption of construction within months of its publication. The full assessment, the document itself, not the summary, uses different language in two passages that the summary does not reproduce. I want to be precise about the nature of this discrepancy because it is easy to overstate and important not to. The summary is not false. It accurately characterizes Casey's overall conclusion. What it omits are two passages in the middle section of the report dealing with what the assessment team encountered when they examined the lower foundation courses, the masonry work laid during the original construction phase between 1848 and 1854. In the first omitted passage, Casey's report describes evidence of prior excavation below the foundation course, of dimensions and purpose not accounted for in the original construction specifications available to this survey. In the second, the report notes the presence of a sealed access, the origins of which predate the current foundation course, and which this survey does not recommend disturbing pending further review. The further review is not referenced again in any subsequent Army Corps document that I have found. Stand at the base of the Washington Monument on any clear morning and look up. The shaft rises 555 feet above you, white marble courses stacked in a line so precise and vertical that it reads as a single object rather than an assembly of parts. But if you know where to look, and the National Park Service's interpretive materials do note this, though they frame it as an architectural curiosity rather than an anomaly, you can see the place where the original construction ended and the resumed construction began. It is visible in the marble itself. The lower courses, laid between 1848 and 1854, came from the Blue Ridge Quarry in Maryland. The upper courses, laid from 1879 through 1884, came from a different quarry in Massachusetts. The stone is not the same color. The Maryland marble has a slightly warmer tone, a trace of pink in certain lights. The Massachusetts marble is cooler, grayer, at approximately 150 feet above the ground. Precisely where the halt occurred, precisely where the construction gap begins in the documentary record, the color of the building changes. The building is a document. It records its own interruption in the stone. Every visitor who looks at the monument is seeing the evidence of the gap, whether or not they know to read it that way. The color change is not hidden. It is simply not explained. What was found below the foundation course during Casey's 1879 survey, what he described as prior excavation of dimensions and purpose not accounted for in the available specifications, what he noted as a sealed access predating the current foundation, was acknowledged in a document that was then summarized in a way that omitted those findings. The full document exists. It is held in the Army Corps of Engineers Historical Division in Alexandria, Virginia. It has been available to researchers for decades. The passages I am describing are on pages 31 and 32 of the full assessment, in Casey's own handwriting for the marginal annotations, typescript for the main body. They have not, to my knowledge, been cited in any published history of the Washington Monument. That is not the same as suppression. I want to be careful with that word, and I'm choosing not to use it. What I'm saying is that a document exists, held in a named archive, accessible to any researcher who requests it, containing specific language about prior excavation and a sealed access beneath the monument's foundation, and that this language did not appear in the congressional summary, did not appear in the Army Corps' published report, and has not appeared in the secondary literature that subsequent historians have drawn on when writing the monument's official history. The document remembers. The histories do not. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, born in Paris in 1754 and brought to Washington to design the federal city from its first surveyed lines, placed the Washington Monument's intended site at a specific geometric intersection. His plan, the original plan submitted to President Washington in 1791 and preserved in the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division, locates the monument at the precise point where the east-west axis running from the Capitol building crosses the north-south axis running from the President's house. 2 lines, 1 point. The monument was to stand exactly there, at the origin of the city's entire spatial logic, the fixed point from which every other distance and bearing in the Capitol could theoretically be derived. It does not stand there. The Army Corps of Engineers confirmed the offset in their 1879 foundation assessment. The monument's actual position sits approximately 370 feet to the southeast of L'Enfant's intended intersection, a displacement that is visually undetectable to any visitor standing on the mall, but geometrically significant to any surveyor who lays the original plan over the current site. The official explanation, repeated in the National Park Service's interpretive materials and in the standard architectural histories, is that the soil at L'Enfant's intended point was too marshy to support a structure of the monument's intended weight, and that the Corps relocated the foundation to firmer ground. This explanation is documented. The soil conditions at the intended site were poor. Casey's team noted this in their 1879 assessment, and it appears in the congressional testimony supporting the resumed construction. Reasonable. The soil explanation is reasonable. What the soil explanation does not account for is a detail in the same 1879 Army Corps assessment that noted the offset. The detail I described in the previous section, the language about prior excavation and a sealed access at the foundation course. That language appears at pages 31 and 32 of Casey's full report. The soil explanation appears at pages 8 through 11. They are in the same document. One was reproduced in the published summary, the other was not. The Library of Congress holds Casey's papers, including his personal correspondence from the 1879 assessment period. In a letter to his brother dated September of 1879, Casey wrote that the site presented complications of a prior nature that he was not at liberty to characterize further in this correspondence. He used the phrase prior nature without elaboration. The letter is in the Casey collection. It has been available to researchers for over a century, not evasion, documentation. Which brings me to what the National Park Service found in 1934. During a renovation and reinforcement project authorized by Congress and carried out between 1933 and 1936, Park Service engineers conducted a full inspection of the monument's foundation as part of the structural assessment required before any load-bearing modifications could proceed. The inspection records from that project are held at the National Park Service's History Collection in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. They describe, among other findings, a below-grade space accessible from the interior base of the monument, located beneath the lowest finished course of the original construction and measuring, in the words of the inspection record, approximately 22 feet in its longest internal dimension, with walls of dressed stone on 3 sides and poured material. The inspection report uses the word concrete, though the composition was not formally analyzed. On the 4th side and overhead, the floor of the space, the report notes, was not excavated during the inspection. The decision recorded in the project file was to seal the access rather than investigate further on the grounds that investigation would require structural disturbance, inconsistent with the project's reinforcement mandate. The access was sealed. The material used was Portland cement mortar, applied over the existing opening in a quantity sufficient to render the access indistinguishable from the surrounding foundation masonry. The authorization for the sealing decision was signed by the project's supervising engineer, whose name appears in the project file. The decision itself required no congressional approval because it was classified within the project's existing mandate as a structural action rather than an archaeological one. The National Park Service's own records confirm these details. The interpretation of what they mean, whether a below-grade space of those dimensions in that location, sealed in that manner, constitutes evidence of Mills's original subterranean repository or something else entirely, is mine, and I hold it with the tentativeness appropriate to a conclusion built on incomplete evidence. But here is the pattern stated plainly in sequence for the first time. In 1846, Robert Mills submitted design drawings to the Washington National Monument Society, specifying a below-grade repository beneath the colonnaded base. In 1848, the cornerstone was laid and foundation excavation began. In 1849, Thomas Clary appears in the first payroll ledger, working as a stonecutter on the site. Between 1848 and 1854, the foundation construction records document above-grade work in detail and below-grade work not at all. In 1854, the construction halted. In 1855, the Know Nothing Party seized control of the Monument Society, and the Society's construction records were transferred to a receiving institution that subsequent researchers have not been able to confirm. In 1871, the Bureau of Indian Affairs fire consumed 40,000 documents, including Washington's territorial administrative records from the construction period. In 1879, the Army Corps of Engineers conducted a foundation assessment, found prior excavation and a sealed access not accounted for in the available specifications, and published a summary that omitted both findings. In 1884, the monument was completed and capped. In 1921, the Census Bureau fire consumed 62 million individual records and the accompanying administrative correspondence files from the monument's completion era. In 1934, Park Service engineers found and sealed a below-grade space of significant dimensions beneath the original foundation course, classifying the action as structural rather than archaeological, requiring no further review. The last living person with direct knowledge of that inspection died before any systematic historical inquiry into the monument's foundation history was undertaken. That is the sequence. Each event has an explanation. Every explanation is individually adequate. The funding ran out, the building was too heavy for the soil, the fire started in the wiring. The records were transferred and the transfer was not completed. The space was sealed because excavating it exceeded the project's mandate. These explanations do not contradict each other. They do not require coordination. They require only that a series of institutions across a span of 90 years consistently chose the path of least documentary disturbance whenever they encountered something beneath the monument's foundation that exceeded their immediate mandate to address. That is one way to read the sequence. The other way is to note that what remains after all of it, after the fires and the transfers and the sealed access and the incomplete finding aids, is a structure whose below-grade history is almost entirely invisible, whose foundation contains a sealed space of documented dimensions that has not been opened since 1934, and whose original architect specified in his own handwriting a subterranean repository that the official record insists was never built. Is the soil explanation sufficient? Is institutional entropy sufficient? The Army Corps confirmed the offset, confirmed the prior excavation, confirmed the sealed access, and the published summary reproduced none of it. Does that constitute a pattern of deliberate omission, or simply the ordinary tendency of institutional summaries to exclude findings outside their operational scope? The document does not answer this. Casey's letter does not answer this. The 1934 project file does not answer this. They describe, they record, they preserve, in their careful bureaucratic language, the outline of something that has not been named directly in any official history of the Washington Monument in the 140 years since the capstone was placed. The pattern is visible. The conclusion remains open. The last person with direct knowledge of what the 1934 inspection found beneath the Washington Monument's foundation was a man named Harold Fenwick Albright, born in 1879 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and employed by the National Park Service from 1928 until his retirement in 1947. Albright, no relation to Horace Albright, the more prominently documented Park Service director of the same era, served as a supervising structural inspector during the 1933 through 1936 renovation project, the same project whose records describe the below-grade space of approximately 22 feet in its longest internal dimension, the dressed stone walls on 3 sides, the poured material overhead, the decision to seal rather than excavate. His signature appears on the project's final disposition report, filed in the spring of 1936. He was 57 years old when he signed it. Harold Fenwick Albright retired to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1947. He died in 1961 at the age of 82. The obituary published in the Harrisburg Patriot News on the 14th of March, 1961, describes him as a federal civil servant of 30 years, a veteran of the First World War, and a resident of the Harrisburg area for the final 14 years of his life. It does not mention the Washington Monument. It does not mention the 1934 inspection. It does not mention what he found or what he authorized to be sealed in the spring of that year. The obituary is 11 sentences long. It is the last public record of a man who stood inside the space beneath the monument's foundation and then lived for 25 years afterward without, so far as the documentary record shows, telling anyone what it contained. That silence has a weight to it that is different from institutional silence. Institutions lose records through entropy, through fire, through the ordinary indifference of bureaucratic succession. A man who lives 25 years with direct knowledge of something and who does not write it down, does not speak it into the record, does not leave a deposition or a memoir or even a letter to his children describing what he saw. That silence is a different kind. It may be the silence of a man who was told not to speak. It may be the silence of a man who decided on his own that speaking served no purpose. It may be the silence of a man who did not understand the significance of what he had seen, who sealed a foundation space as a matter of structural procedure and never thought about it again. The documentary record does not distinguish between these possibilities. It preserves only the silence itself. Harold Fenwick Albright died in 1961, the same year that the Smithsonian Institution Archives conducted the cataloging review that is the last confirmed sighting of the foundation construction records from the monument's original building phase. Whether this is coincidence is a question the record cannot answer. It is the kind of alignment that accumulates meaning not because either event is extraordinary on its own, but because the pattern has by this point established a grammar. Each time the chain of memory reaches its last link, something in the documentary record reaches a boundary at the same moment. Albright dies. The construction records become unretrievable. The last living person with direct knowledge of the sealed space and the last confirmed location of the records that would have described what that space was built to contain. Both gone within months of each other in a year that most histories of the monument do not find worth mentioning. What remains is this. The Smithsonian Institution Archives holds the above-grade construction records from the monument's original building phase. The marble procurement invoices, the labor rosters, the quarterly payroll ledgers, in which Thomas Clary's name appears 54 times and then does not appear again. These records are present, intact, accessible to any researcher who submits a request through the reading room. The finding aid entry for the below-grade foundation construction records, the companion files that would speak to what was built beneath the foundation course between 1848 and 1854 remains in the catalog. The box it references has not been successfully retrieved since 1961. The Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division holds Robert Mills's design drawings, including the cross-sectional specifications for the subterranean repository he dimensioned and notated in 1846. Those drawings are available. The notes in Mills's hand are legible. What they describe was never officially acknowledged as having been built, and the records that would confirm or deny it are in a box that the finding aid can locate, and the archive cannot. The Army Corps of Engineers Historical Division in Alexandria, Virginia, holds the full text of Thomas Lincoln Casey's 1879 Foundation Assessment, not the published summary, the full document, in which Casey described prior excavation of dimensions and purpose not accounted for in the available specifications, and a sealed access predating the current foundation course. Those pages are present. They have been present for 145 years. They have not been cited in any published history of the monument that I have been able to locate. The National Park Service History Collection in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, holds the 1934 renovation project file, including the foundation inspection records that describe the below-grade space, the decision to seal it, and the materials used. Harold Fenwick Albright's signature is on the final disposition report. The file is cataloged. The file is accessible. The archive remembers. That is the thing that no institutional entropy and no accidental fire and no misfiled box has fully managed to prevent. The archive remembers in fragments, in distributed pieces held across 4 institutions in 3 states, none of which individually constitutes proof of anything, all of which together constitute the outline of something that the official history of the Washington Monument has never been required to address. A subterranean repository specified by the original architect and never officially acknowledged as built. A foundation assessment that described prior excavation and a sealed access, and was summarized in a way that omitted both findings. A renovation project that found a below-grade space of significant dimensions, sealed it as a structural matter, classified it as outside the archaeological mandate, and filed the paperwork in a collection that is accessible to any researcher and has been for 90 years. The sealed chamber is still there. That is what the official record confirms, by what it does not deny. The 1934 project file records the sealing. No subsequent project file records an unsealing. The National Park Service's current structural documentation of the monument lists the foundation as sealed in the 1880s and not disturbed since, a characterization that the 1934 project file contradicts, and which no one has formally reconciled. The sealed chamber sits beneath the most visited monument on the National Mall, beneath 2 million annual visitors, beneath the marble courses that every schoolbook photographs and every civic ceremony invokes as the image of a nation's foundational permanence. Robert Mills drew it in 1846, dimensioned it, specified its walls, called it a repository, and said nothing further about what it was meant to hold. Thomas Clary worked above and below the foundation line for 54 months and then disappeared from the payroll ledger without notation. Thomas Lincoln Casey found evidence of it in 1879, recorded his findings in a report, and watched those findings disappear from the published summary. Harold Fenwick Albright stood inside it in 1934, signed the order to seal it, and lived for 25 years without leaving a written account of what he saw. The Washington Monument is not a memorial to George Washington. It is a vault that has been described in fragments by everyone who came close enough to see it, and remembered in full by no one who is still alive to say what it contains.